Mentioned Ontario revealing vaccine policies for some workers, including those in the health and education sectors. Here's what you need to know. Government says they're needed to help combat the highly infectious Delta variant as fall and winter approaches. Here's the question. Can employers mandate vaccines? Employment lawyer Lior Samfiru from Samfiru Tumarkin LLP is here to help us navigate the laws. Good morning. Good to see you, Lior.
Good morning, Leslie.
So this basically avoids a court challenge, does it not?
Well, we call this, or the government has called this, mandatory vaccine policy. But really what's mandatory is for these employers in these settings to have policies. What's not mandatory is actually to have a vaccine. Because individuals that are not going to get vaccinated, that choose not to, are not going to be required in order to continue working. They're going to have to go through some training, and ultimately, if they still refuse, they have to go through various tests so that they can show that they don't have the virus. But there's still no requirement that you have to get vaccinated or else, similar to what the federal government has done. So despite what the Ontario government announced yesterday, there's still no ability yet to impose vaccines or risk losing your job.
Now, let's say after 2 or 3 weeks, you're just fed up with the testing, because they say it's going to be quite regularly, and you refuse. Are those grounds for dismissal?
Yes, at that point, an employee that refuses to get the test and refuses to get vaccinated will be able to be let go by their employer, because simply at that point, regardless of what the employer thinks, there will be no choice, simply because that is what the government has dictated. And for an employee in that situation, that's a very bad thing to have happen, because not only do you lose your job, which is bad enough, you would also not qualify for government benefits, you would not get severance. So certainly individuals that refuse to get vaccinated and tested will probably find themselves in a form of a financial ruin, potentially.
Across the river in Quebec, we're hearing it is going to be mandatory for healthcare workers in particular. Do you expect a civil rights challenge, and would it fall to that challenge, or would it be upheld given the greater good of public health?
So we've heard that in Quebec, we've heard in BC as well, that long-term care homes have mandated vaccines. I do think there will be a challenge. Keep in mind, though, a challenge like this, of this magnitude, takes a long time to go through the courts, potentially all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. I ultimately think that the government will prevail because this is for the greater good, the public good. But either way, it's not going to help those individuals that refuse to get vaccinated simply because of the time frame for dealing with such a legal challenge.
All right, outside of government, do employers have the right to ask you to get vaccinated?
That is the number one question I've been getting, Leslie, and the reality is that no, at this time, because the government has not implemented mandatory vaccines, an employer does not have the ability to require vaccines, except maybe in situations where it's impossible to do social distancing and impossible to mask. In most industries, your employer still cannot mandate a vaccine, and if you lose your job because you have not been vaccinated, that could be a human rights violation. So there's certainly some caution there that employers need to be aware of.
Can a boss ask an employee their vaccination status?
In Ontario, the Occupational Health and Safety Act says that an employer cannot demand private medical information from the employee, and arguably a vaccination status would be covered under that. So no, the reality is that an employer cannot mandate answers about vaccines unless, of course, the government said that we're going to make an exception here. We're going to allow that to happen. So a lot of employers are doing this, Leslie. They're telling employees, we must know right now if you've been vaccinated. That arguably is a breach of laws here in Ontario. A lot of employers may not care about that, but that does come with significant liability.
What about employee to employee? Someone who may be vulnerable, have immuno-compromised issues, and they're going back to the office. Do they have the right to ask the people in the other cubicles whether they're vaccinated?
No employee is required by privacy laws to disclose their medical information, their vaccination status. So you may certainly ask, but there's no ability to require someone, a colleague, a friend, a coworker, to tell you if they've been vaccinated or not. Ultimately, you have to put trust in what the government has implemented, which is workplaces right now are still deemed safe as long as certain measures are taking place. Masking, social distancing, limiting number of people. And those obligations must be put in place. Those requirements have to be followed. If they are followed, workplaces are deemed safe, and employees that refuse to go to work in those situations may find themselves in a precarious situation.
If they're nervous to go back to work because there's no transparency on this vaccination status between boss, employees, and so on. Do they have the right to work from home?
Well, employees don't have an automatic right to work from home. It's certainly a very comfortable and elegant solution in many of these situations, and a lot of employers understand that. It certainly is worthwhile asking. A lot of employers are accommodating. But as long as the employer is following what the government has said it must do to keep the workplace safe, it can expect employees to work at work in the office. So ask the question. A lot of employers are quite happy to allow that to happen, but it's not a given that you can be allowed to work from home, despite the fact that we're still very much dealing with this pandemic.
I know there's lots to navigate, a lot of potential scenarios playing out here. When in doubt, consult an employment lawyer to know your rights is the takeaway.
Always a good idea for both employers and employees because things are changing fairly quickly.
All right, employment lawyer Lior Samfiru, thank you. Appreciate it, Lior. Good to see you.
Thank you, Leslie.